Hi, I'm Debbie Moraes. Once again, this is Legal Matters, the program that's been designed to address the critical, timely, sometimes contentious matters that are facing consumers and businesses today. It's legal information, it's practical solutions, and straight talk about a wide variety of issues that affect your home and work life. In our last segment, we had a happy segment. We were talking about adoption, and we had the privilege of having an adoptive family who had worked with David Bizarre very recently, and in celebration and commemoration of National Adoption Day. Today we're going to be having another discussion about personal matters. Not quite so happy, unfortunately, but considering everywhere in the news there is information floating around about sexual harassment, sexual abuse, molestation, child abuse, and we think that it needs to be addressed. So today we have with us, once again, a guest who specializes, who has had much experience with that. We would like to welcome today, first, Tim Conlon, who has his own legal firm in Providence, and he specializes in, or his practice is focusing on, things that are to do with family life. And as we understand, very recently, he had been among the Rhode Island trial lawyers receiving an award for having, I guess, the case of the year, and it absolutely did focus on the child abuse case, specifically Rhode Island's clergy issues. So we are happy that you're with us today. And once again, we would like to welcome, as always, Jackie Grasso and David Bizarre from Odette Bizarre, Cordero Grasso Law Firm in East Providence. I think it makes sense that we should start with and open this up to the Penn State situation, and specifically the debacle that is. And as of today, as of this viewing, it's 50 counts, 10 victims that have come forward. And since we've all heard these allegations, and presumably everyone is innocent until proven guilty in this country, which is wonderful, what have we learned about how these things are handled when we understand that if you wait, you could be in trouble, you could be sued? If you wrongly accuse someone, you could be in trouble. If you don't, you could be in trouble. What are we supposed to learn about how to handle these situations? There are so many of them.
Well, when you say wrongly accuse, it is not really the role of the supervisor who becomes aware of an allegation to, quote, accuse someone.
Okay.
So if I'm Joe Paterno, for instance, and I'm told that someone under me has witnessed something, I'm not going to, quote, accuse someone. The question is, what are you going to do to get that information to law enforcement to protect kids? It really isn't about private people acting as police forces and accusing anyone. It's about passing information on as opposed to cutting it off.
And where is there an issue about what they're legally responsible to do versus perhaps morally responsible to do? Is there a difference, or is it all the same? What are the parameters?
Well, on one level, I don't think it is really all that different, in the sense that from a legal point of view, what you're supposed to be doing is what is reasonable and exercising reasonable care. Unfortunately, what has happened historically is that people, as you said, sexual abuse is not exactly a pleasant topic, and it's a topic that makes people uncomfortable. The person who's coming to someone with a report is going to be ashamed, they're going to be uncomfortable. They're not going to necessarily be as coherent, cogent, forthcoming with details as they might be. When the person receives it, there's something of a natural tendency to want to discount or perhaps not believe that, well, it can't be that they're saying that type of thing. Particularly when you're dealing with children, the ability of the person who's reporting the problem to be very clear and get the point across is somewhat compromised. So unfortunately, there are historically institutional responses other than to protect the child. I don't think that the person who gets the information has to, quote, accuse. You certainly don't need to go out to the public and announce something, but going to the authorities with the information so that it can be handled professionally is important, and historically that's been a problem in many institutions.
Reporting, does that mean just being reported to, say, Penn State athletic director or vice president, or pick up the phone and call the police, we think you should check this out?
Well, first of all, I want to be clear. I'm not licensed in Pennsylvania, so I'm not going to tell you what I know, because I don't know what Pennsylvania law requires. But if you're asking me from my experience what the appropriate thing to do is, it's to turn it over to law enforcement, period, end of discussion. Because Law enforcement is designed, okay, to not prosecute bad cases. I mean, the police get complaints all the time that are unfounded. So the idea that you're doing something wrong by turning something over to the police, frankly, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Unless you want to put yourself, and this is the mistake that many people will make, unless you want to put yourself in the position of being the grand jury, of being the decider with regards to credibility, you really need to turn it over to professionals, because that's what they do. Certainly here in Rhode Island, you know, we have agencies that are specifically tasked for interviewing children, for example, and they have a protocol, and they have trained staff, and they have videotape machines, and they do what they do to interview a child. Now, one can debate whether or not their interview was perfect or not, but everybody can see that interview, and that protocol is established. So if you short-circuit the process, again, on some level, there's a natural human tendency to freak out when you get information that isn't, you know, something as abnormal as that. But, you know, try it this way. If a child comes to a parent and says they're sexually abused, I can tell you from a clinical point of view, and again, not that I'm a clinician, but in speaking to clinicians, I've learned this over the years, the best thing that the parent can do is not overreact. Now, having said that, you know, how many mothers, if their child came in and said they were sexually abused, are going to be able to just maintain total calm? Okay, well, let's see now, we're going to call the doctor, we're going to call, et cetera, et cetera. They're probably going to have the same reaction any mother would have or any parent might have, which is, you know, oh my gosh. Well, the more dramatically that the parent and the more upsettedly the parent reacts to it, the more the child perceives that something horrible has happened. I mean, it just makes common sense. I know when my daughter was very young, she cut herself and she was bleeding rather dramatically. I saw it and I said, ooh, Colleen, that's a bad cut. And then somebody else saw it and went, ah! Well, as soon as that happened, Colleen started to cry. Colleen wasn't crying. She was concerned, but we were going to deal with it. It went from we were going to deal with it to, oh my gosh, basically because she saw another adult in shock. So similarly, if a child perceives from the reaction of the people that that child entrusts with his or her life, the parents, complete shock, dismay, aghast, oh my gosh, the world is coming to an end, then the kid has just figured out that the world is coming to an end, and by the way, somehow I had something to do with it, or maybe even I caused it, which of course is the last thing that is true. But with a child, they're going to draw conclusions. So the reaction of the parent has its own effect on the child. You are not in a position, if you're a parent, certainly if you're a school administrator, you're somebody in a coaching staff, you're not in a position to launch a criminal investigation, to launch a child sexual abuse investigation, to do an investigation of who stole $20 in lunch money. Really doesn't make any sense. If we're talking about $20 in lunch money and you want to go through it informally, internally, what difference does it make? Maybe you got somebody pickpocketing 20 bucks out of the lunch boxes. It's not like the world's going to come in.
Here.
Correct. But when we're talking about someone who's inappropriately touched a child, this is not something that should be treated in the same way you might deal with some other form of misconduct. And it should be handled professionally.
In an educational setting, medical setting, these individuals have an obligation, a legal obligation, to disclose it to authorities.
That's certainly true in Rhode Island.
To authorities, and again,
and Massachusetts.
And again, the authority, it makes sense that if someone were to see the act going on, that may be one thing, but if they're just hearing about it, that by degrees is might change, David, how and to whom they're going to respond?
The same. If you work at a school, if you work at a medical facility, the obligation in Rhode Island, and as Jackie said, Massachusetts, is it has to be reported. Now, what's interesting is I've had some conversations with Tim about this situation, and I don't think we've mentioned this, but Tim has had a lot of experience representing children and their families in different settings, from the coaches that are being involved in some of the more recent stuff, but there's a lot of things that is analogous and really applies. Can you talk about that a little bit, Tim?
Well, at least from my experience, the modus operandi, the way that perpetrators go about what they do, whether it's in the clergy instance, whether it's in a school department or a school teacher, or it's in a coaching situation, is actually remarkably similar, okay? They, first of all, have got themselves into a position where they're a trusted authority figure, whether it's a priest, a coach, or a teacher. They have tended, in my experience, to find kids who are vulnerable on some level. In other words, you know, I think of 3 students that I represented. One, the father was deceased. One, the father was an alcoholic. The other one, the father was absent. So in each instance, you had a young boy who needed a male authority figure. They then will, I don't want to say push, but offer themselves to the family as a helping hand, if you will. I can't tell you how many priests that I was involved with, you know, the family basically entrusted the child to the priest for help. Oh, Johnny's being a little problem.
Makes
I'm
sense.
really good with,
Of course.
you know. And similarly, a coach who offers to provide extra attention to your child when your child's in an athletic program. Well, I mean, most parents are really dying to have the child, you know, get the attention of the coach. You look to your coaches for guidance. You look for them to, you know, sometimes the kid is in, how many kids have been enrolled in a sporting activity with the notion that, well, this will give them some sense of discipline, some sense of achievement, some sense of self-confidence. So as a parent, people go to these programs looking to help the child. The coach, if the coach is ill-intended, can identify kids who are particularly needy. And pedophiles, if they're one thing, they're very clever in terms of personal relationships and intuition and such. So the next thing you know, they've honed in on kids who are particularly vulnerable with parents who are particularly busy or otherwise occupied or in a fractured family or ill or what have you. And it is something of a recipe for disaster.
Looking at how the Penn State situation, where that's an institution, a powerful institution that had certain protections, not very dissimilar to whether it was Rhode Island or even the Vatican, where they had enough of an institution that they wanted to protect it rather than the individuals. Do you find that the larger the institution, that they're more likely to want to shut that down, close that down, and protect the institution or the program rather than the individual? And when do you intercept and derail that or change that?
What I would say, and this is a sad statement, but it's true, the larger the institution, the more successful they can be at doing it. And again, you could talk about, you know, some sort of maliciousness, but practically speaking, I think large or small, no institution wants to have a pedophile in their midst. So they don't want to believe that this is the case. That's the first thing. The second thing is, even if they begin to suspect that there is a problem, there is an institutional bias towards protecting the institution and making the problem go away. I will tell you that many parents of children who have been abused innocently, when they go to the authorities, whether it's at the church, school, whatever, they don't want to see a criminal prosecution. They don't want to see a mess. Now, it may be that from a public policy point of view, there needs to be a criminal prosecution, but it's not as if you, God forbid, found out something happened to your child, that you're looking to see your child put through a criminal process. You just want the problem addressed and the teacher or the coach or whatever gotten out of Dodge. So there's a lot of forces at play, both in terms of the parents, the shame, the victim, and the institution, that want to make the problem go away. And that's where the necessity of objectivity comes in. A district attorney's office or a child protective agency has an interest in protecting children generally, not just dealing with this problem. If indeed a mother is told, well, we're going to send the priest away, we're going to see that he gets help, the mother would much rather believe that and accept that the child is now safe because the priest is out of the parish. Now, practically speaking, that mother, and I'm thinking of a particular mother in Woonsocket, had no way of knowing what actually did happen with that priest, and said to me that for 20 years, every time she heard in the news that a priest was in trouble, her heart was in her throat because, oh, God forbid, it would be this priest, and it wasn't. And every time she was okay until indeed it was that priest.
It raises two interesting issues that I'd like you to think about and address. One is a lot of times these things come up after the child.
Sure.
And so talk a little bit about why that happens and the statute of limitations, both criminal and civil. And I know we're going to keep this within your area of expertise, not Penn State or Syracuse or some other place.
Right, right. Well, I mean, historically, the reporting rate for victims, certainly over time, you're not going to find a significant number of kids coming forward to report that kind of conduct in the near term. The perpetrators are going to engage, and they do engage, in a massive campaign to silence the victim. So whether it's they're saying don't tell, whether it's they're bribing the victim, in many instances alcohol is used, things that, you know, forbidden fruit that is dangled out that then turns into a guilt trip. But the perpetrators have a variety of techniques, favoritism, promises, threats to the parents, you name it. But the bottom line is that you have a lot of kids who are victims who have been convinced that they cannot possibly let anybody know that this has happened. Right. Now, this is all mythology in the sense that I've got to say that I'm hard-pressed to think of even one of my victims who, living with many instances, decades of believing that they couldn't tell mom and dad, when they told mom and dad welcomed them into their arms. Mom and dad became a tremendous sense of support. Mom and dad said, oh my gosh, you know, why couldn't you have told us before? Right. You know, basically did all of the right things to wrap their arms around that child. But for whatever reason, the child had lived through, in many instances, decades of belief that he or she just couldn't tell mom or couldn't tell dad.
So you find, generally speaking, most of those victims disclose later on in life.
Correct. Okay. Something will happen. I mean, I think of one child one young man who had a niece or nephew who was offended against, and his, I forget whether it's cousin or sister, but in any event, some other member of the family started talking about the niece or nephew. And then he started talking to the niece or nephew about how it's okay and not to worry, and in the course of all of that, started to confront the fact that he himself had been offended and realized he needed to speak up. Because here he was telling this young 7-year-old child that it was okay, and he had himself not spoken. You know, I was mentioning to you earlier, having gone out to Butler Hospital one time because there was some young girl who had been hospitalized after a suicide attempt, and there was a school teacher who was calling her incessantly, and the people at the hospital really suspected that something was awry. The mother was not, she was Hispanic, so her English wasn't that great. A family member got in touch with us, and I went out to the hospital to represent the gal, and the gal, I think was 13 or 14 at the time, ultimately disclosed that this female school teacher had basically been having an affair with this kid for about 2.5 years, and now the kid was meltdown mode, was attempting suicide, and the school teacher was basically calling the hospital, going out to the hospital, you know, are you okay, are you okay, but then don't say anything about us. Yeah. So you've got a kid who desperately needs help, who's you know, ready to kill herself, and she can't get help because the perpetrator is trying to muzzle her. So it's a pretty dramatic problem in terms of if you're expecting these kids to just come flying out and give you the information. Now, what you'll see, and it doesn't shock me that Sandusky having become notorious, you're seeing more people coming forward. As the ice is broken and people come out and the victims perceive that it's safe to say something, they see somebody else do something where they disclose and they realize, well, gosh, you know, if he can speak up, I should be able to speak up.
What causes that situation to come to a head where now everyone can come out of the woodwork and they might need to be vetted, but the floodgates are now open, and at some point, I imagine that Penn State, just as Herman Cain's Restaurant Association could make it go away for $40,000. Penn State could have perhaps done that early on, and then certainly can't now. And now look at the dimension of these civil cases that are going to continue for decades or whatever.
Today, I mean, at least in terms of certainly the Catholic Church in Rhode Island, and I'd say generally speaking, the attentiveness around settlements not being confidential, and the idea that settlements, I mean, there was a time, for instance, when the Catholic Church was settling cases with confidentiality agreements, and that would play into the problem. And you mentioned that as a possible avenue that Penn State might have pursued a number of years ago. But today, at least in Rhode Island, confidentiality agreements around private settlements on sexual abuse cases are not looked at favorably. I'm not saying it never happens, but it is not the common practice that it was. And now we're back to what I said before about why it is you want to have law enforcement involved. From my end, you know, if people are willing to speak to the police, then that's telling you something about their level of confidence and sincerity about what it is that they're reporting. And you need to give the information to law enforcement, because no matter what, I'm just a private attorney, so no matter what I do, I mean, it was certainly helpful, I think, that I went out to the hospital for that girl. The next person who went after me was a state trooper. And, you know, I went out there so my client could give a statement to the state police. You know, I had to talk to her to get her to the point where she understood it was okay to talk to the state police, and this wacky teacher who was calling her and harassing her, we were going to put an end to her. But once she understood that she was going to be protected from the teacher and that, you know, the police were there to help her, you know, and she was able to get that much trust together, then, you know, she spoke to the police.
So it goes back to the two questions, one that I've already asked that we haven't gotten to, and another one that when you were in the heyday of all of those claims against the clergy, how did you vet out which ones you thought had merit and which ones didn't? And also tell us again how you dealt with the SOL on the ones that were from people who had been offended sometime prior.
Okay, well, let's just break those down into, so I don't forget your questions.
Okay.
I mean, first of all, in terms of there certainly were, I can think of one or two instances where I was not comfortable with the information that I was given, for whatever reason. I mean, it varied from case to case. One thing I will tell you that, at least in my experience, the number of people who are willing to go through what you go through to disclose this kind of stuff, just for the sake of doing it, it's not a really big problem. I mean, I can understand why in the public's mind, oh, well, couldn't you just say you were sexually abused? Well, the fact of the matter is, if you've sat, as I have, with, you know, dozens, hundreds really, of people who've been sexually offended against, there's a certain commonality to the way that they speak. I mean, I'll tell you that literally, one of you mentioned Father O'Connell. I can tell you the man likes scotch. And I can tell you that because the little boys
know that.
all got scotch.
That's right.
Not rum, you know, not beer, but scotch.
Yeah.
So when you're sitting with a guy who's telling you that Father O'Connell got him drunk on scotch, I mean, maybe he just had a drink with Father O'Connell in his adult life, I suppose. But it's just awfully funny that the MO would line up that way. And that and the commonality of experience, etc., you know, there would just be too many patterns. You know, the school teacher that I was referencing earlier, I don't know exactly why, but the bottom line is virtually every allegation, and I had allegations from 5 or 6 different schools that were nowhere near each other, involved hands on boys' buttocks or thighs.
And
so,
the
Tim, would you
SOL.
have to know that would you have to know where the mole is in order to say that that conclusively was an encounter that was inappropriate? Would the father have to have had the mole at a certain place that boy knew, or he?
We're coming full circle to your question about the, quote, droves, because maybe if you only had one victim, I mean, Monica Lewinsky would be the great example of needing some physical corroborative evidence, I suppose. But when the totality of those people line up and the recitations are so similar, and then you plug them back against extrinsic events. I mean, I literally had a mother say, and how a mother could say this is a whole other issue, but, you know, I always wondered about him asking to pack your bikini underwear when you went on a trip. Now, again, today I am quite certain that no parent would need to, quote, wonder why. They would stop right there.
Thank goodness it's out.
But at the time, a good Irish Catholic mother evidently wasn't arguing that was Father O'Connell. Now, if anyone's familiar with the Father O'Connell criminal prosecution, when he was busted, he was found with dozens and dozens of pictures of little boys in bikinis. So, you know, when you've got the mom saying, I always wondered about him asking for the packing the bikini underwear, the fact that the boy traveled with the priest, and then, frankly, with Father O'Connell, blonde-haired and blue eyes, tended to be a preference. So you would have a number of coincidental things that would line up that would make it and as I said, the preference in the terms of the alcohol. In terms of the statute of limitations, I mean, certainly that's a very common problem. If I had a magic wand and could change anything in terms of the law in the state of Rhode Island, I think that our ability to hold institutions accountable is compromised in terms of what other jurisdictions allow. But be this as it may, the bottom line is that where, first of all, the current law tolls the statute until minority plus 3 years from the date of minority, and then there are issues about either misconduct or culpability on the part of an entity in some form of cover-up. And that has certainly been something that we've used.
So if they're involved in some cover-up, then it extends the SOL?
You can certainly argue that it does. There has not been a definitive ruling on this from the Rhode Island Supreme Court. I mean, obviously, the defendants take the position that the day after the 21st birthday that they're off the hook. And then, you know, the plaintiff's counsel views things differently. But there have been instances in which there have been ongoing efforts to cover the misconduct, and I've certainly argued that that tolls the statute.
In the short amount of time that we have left, do you have any information about whether or not the crossing of the state lines takes off the table that statute of limitation, as the Syracuse story, I believe?
What it does is it opens up another statute, because if, and this is something that we became aware of, you know, in connection with the Rhode Island clergy cases, but if a child is taken to Massachusetts and is offended against in Massachusetts, the offense occurred in Massachusetts, and no different than if I get into an auto accident with Jackie in Seekonk, the law is different than if I get in the same auto accident in East Providence. So is to travel to New York and which was Pennsylvania, what have you. You know, each instance that you take a child out of state, you're subjecting yourself to liability in another jurisdiction, both criminally and civilly.
And perhaps some federal law can
Correct. That's a whole other issue as well. But in terms of the civil statute of limitations, yes, you may have a situation where a foreign jurisdiction has a different statute of limitations than Rhode Island.
And is it always that the criminal takes place first, the government does the dirty work, then the civil suits line up behind it?
Well, no, I would not put it that way. In some instances, the civil suits are
concurrent?
As a civil attorney, the last thing I want to do is screw up a criminal case. So if I have to file a civil suit prior to the point where a criminal case is concluded, then I'll do it so as to protect the client's rights. But from my end, the criminal process needs to run, so I don't want to interfere with it.
Thanks.
We thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, Jackie, David. We hope you will stay with us as our discussion of legal matters continues.
Perfect.
Was that a happy?
Done?
Yes.